It's time now for Perspective, where we'll be taking a closer look at the rise of the far right in Sweden. This month's election saw the Sweden Democrats, a party with neo-Nazi roots, become the country's second biggest, with just over 20% of the vote. And for the first time, they were running not as outsiders, but as part of the traditional right-wing coalition. On Monday, the moderate party leader, Ulf Kristersson, got the green light to start forming a government. The Sweden Democrats likely won't be included, but as the largest party in the alliance, they're still expected to have major influence. Well, to talk more about this, my guest today is Dominic Hinde, a journalist and sociology lecturer at the University of Glasgow. He's been traveling around Sweden in recent months since June, ahead of those elections. Dominic Hinde, thank you so much for joining us here on France 24. Let's start with the big question. What do you think are the reasons behind this surge in support for the far-right Sweden Democrats?
I think there's a couple of things. First of all, you have to look at the way in which votes have peeled off from the traditional conservative bloc to the Sweden Democrats. So the votes for the traditional conservative parties in Sweden actually went down at this election, roughly in the same numbers as the Sweden Democrats went up. There's also various issues to do with regional inequalities, a sense that the government has not tackled crime in the way it should have done. And all of the parties together have come out with a common front to try and unseat the Social Democratic Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson. So the messaging from the right has been very, very consistent. And I would say the big difference with this election has been that the other right-wing parties, so the Liberal and Conservative parties, have decided to embrace the Sweden Democrats rather than to work against them.
There's been a lot of talk about how, in general, the discourse on immigration in Sweden has shifted completely to the right when all parties are concerned. What do you think went wrong with Sweden's integration of immigrants?
There's a couple of things there to think about here, I suppose. The first is that in 2015, Sweden took in more migrants per capita than any other country in Europe and didn't really get the support from the European Union to do this. So ended up having to deal with it itself. And that has had consequences. But really, some of the problems about integration are far more long-standing than the 2015 refugee crisis. And some of the issues that Sweden has had with gangs and with gang violence are really not to do with migration since 2015, but are to do with more long-standing social exclusion, which has allowed these gangs to take a hold in some of the cities.
And is there anyone in Sweden, any groups, any other political parties that are pushing back on that idea that immigration is the problem and offering any more constructive alternatives?
I mean, here the Socialist Left Party and the Green Party have been the two more liberal voices, along with the Centre Party, which is another more liberal political party. The problem is that these voices have really struggled to gain any traction in the media, and because the Social Democrats went hard on law and order and migration as well, there's been very little political space for people to debate the actual causes of these social problems that Sweden is experiencing.
And that said, would you say that the media's coverage of the political debate is part of the problem and that could be partially blamed for the rise of the far right?
I think that's definitely a factor. What we've seen in Sweden in the last few years is a normalization of the Sweden Democrats in political discourse by appearing on public television, by appearing in the commercial press. And people have taken the attitude that they deserve a fair hearing, which is obviously part of democracy. But what has actually happened is that the other parties have started to adapt themselves to some of the Sweden Democrat talking points, and that has given the Sweden Democrats new energy.
Here in France, the far right also saw historic scores in this year's election, and there was a lot of criticism of how the far right discourse sort of became mainstream. What do you make of the fact that we're seeing the far right gain traction across different societies in Europe and also over in the US?
Well, I think if we look at the trends across Europe, obviously in France with the National Rally, but even what's happened in the United Kingdom with some of the Brexit activity and elsewhere in Europe, we see that there is a disconnect where voters are very heavily rejecting liberalism as a philosophy in politics. But they're not necessarily going to the left as we might expect. They are going to parties which promise, in some ways, left-wing economic policies, but also very, very restrictive cultural and migration policies. And that is always really how, if we look back in history, how the far right and how fascism has worked in Europe. So we can see some patterns there. I think the liberalism in Europe as a movement needs to really think long and hard about what it's doing. And there's a big debate here in Sweden at the moment about the future of the liberal centre, which used to be a critical part of the Swedish political scene. What we've seen in Sweden really is a shift from the political centre being centre-left to centre to conservative right at this election. And that is going to have long-term implications here and elsewhere.
The far right's historic score was especially surprising to many outside of Sweden, given the country's reputation as this progressive society. Do you think Swedish society has changed, or was that reputation just not right to begin with?
I think Swedish society has changed. Participation in politics is going down. Participation in trade unions has also been declining slowly. There is more of a sense of individualism today in Swedish society than may have been the case 20 or 30 years ago. And I think the most tangible thing, which viewers of France 24 may not realise, is that for so long the Social Democratic Party weren't just in charge of Sweden, but they defined Swedishness and they defined the way the state worked. That's unthinkable in many other countries. And so their hegemony, their control over the state and over the way Sweden works as a society has really taken a hit, and it's uncertain whether or not that will ever return.
And you were traveling around the country speaking to voters. Can you talk a little bit more about the profiles of Sweden Democrat voters? Do they tend to come from certain areas or have any characteristics in common?
Sweden Democrat voters, when you look at the vote share, they tend largely to come from rural areas. There are increasingly large votes in cities for the Sweden Democrats, but their heartland is really the area south of Stockholm, central and southeastern Sweden, which is semi-rural, lots of small towns, and people who feel very, very distant from power, whilst also traditionally being relatively conservative as well. Some of the Sweden Democrat voters I've spoken to, they are, and members in fact, they range from people who are long-time veterans of far-right and extreme-right politics through to people who have been the victims of crime and have decided that the Sweden Democrats are a solution, and also a whole new generation of young politicians who see the Sweden Democrats as a movement on the rise and that they can make a career in the party. So there's that other element there as well.
All right, Dominic Hinde, thank you very much for your insight. We're going to have to leave it there. That was Dominic Hinde, a journalist and sociology lecturer at the University of Glasgow, specializing in Sweden.